See how my slides are going to be. Can you see my slides, Kelly?
No.
Okay, going again. Now?
No.
I don't know why it's doing that.
That's all right, Mary. Henry can share his screens. That's most important. Just read your screen. Just read your slides.
That's too bad. I don't know why, because I know I'm doing it right. Anyway, we'll get started. Good morning, everybody. And welcome to Let's Talk About, we're going to talk about the Adult Protection Act and capacity today. Our weekly sessions, including this session, is funded by United Way, and we're very grateful to them for giving us, for allowing us to do that. I just want to do a little housekeeping here. We're going to, if anybody wants to comment or ask a question, you could put it in the chat box, and Henry and Steve will answer them after they're finished the presentations. And we've got, well, obviously you have sign language interpreters here this morning. And we are recording this session. And tomorrow, or not tomorrow, Monday, tomorrow Saturday, we'll be sending out a link to the YouTube recording for everybody so that you can refer to it again later on if you need to. During pre-COVID days, staff, volunteers, and often partners of Seniors NL spent a lot of time traveling around the province, giving presentations, doing training sessions, and bringing seniors together to share information and learn from one another. On a number of occasions, we invited all these seniors to fill out a survey. And one of the questions we asked a lot on the survey was, do you think elder abuse is happening in your community? The no responses were dominant.
Hi, this is Megan. May I interrupt for one moment, please?
Yep.
How do we pin the interpreter, Danica? Because we're going, Miles is saying up in the corner, but it says to chat. How do we do the chat? And so Arthur is saying, is it up in the top corner? And they're saying, no, it's just chat. I only see chat. I don't see how we can make the interpreter large on the screen as in pinning.
Oh, this is Kelly. I have them spotlighted. I can see the two of you side by side. So they cannot see themselves side by side, cannot see you side by side?
I can see the interpreter, but she's only small. I'd like to have her bigger
Oh.
on the screen as in pinned.
Well, you are pinned. I think they need to make their screen bigger, make the full Zoom meeting bigger. So you'd go up on top right-hand corner. There should be the little square. Or if you click view and say full screen.
Oh, that's better. That's better.
Yay.
Thank you.
Oh, great. Excellent. Okay.
Yeah, they're just having a conversation between each other right now. So.
Yep.
So Miles is saying, yeah, he's basically just explaining to the other individuals what to do. So Miles said, that's okay, no worries. Okay, we're all good. We're all good. Let's go.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Great. Okay.
Okay, we'll move on.
Terribly sorry for the interruption there, folks.
No, that's okay. We want to make sure everybody can see the presentation. Wonderful.
Okay, we ready to go again? All right, a lot of times when we, one of the questions we would ask on the survey is, do you think elder abuse is happening in your community? Just about everybody said no, no elder abuse in my community. Well, actually, that's not true. Elder abuse is alive and well in Newfoundland and Labrador. And actually, at some of those events where all the people said, no, there's no elder abuse in my community, after the event was over, one or two of them would come up and say, well, I do think that my neighbor is being abused, you know, but they didn't know, they didn't recognize the abuse. They thought it, they suspected it, but they weren't sure. Anyway, today our guest speakers are going to talk with us about a piece of our province's legislation intended to offer protection to a portion of the population considered to lack the understanding necessary to recognize that they are being abused or neglected. And we have with us Henry Kielley, who you probably all know, and Steve Ross. And they are with the Department of Children, Seniors, and Social Development. And Henry is the director, and Steve is the adult protection consultant. Do I have that right, Steve?
Yes, yeah.
Anyway, I'm going to pass the mic over to Henry now, and he will have better success at showing his slides than I did at showing mine.
Okay.
Henry, go ahead.
Great. Thank you very much, Mary. I hope I can share my screen. Okay, let's try. Is that okay for everyone?
Perfect.
It's okay, and the interpreters are on the side for everyone?
Yes, we can see the interpreters.
Great.
Excellent. That's great. Thank you so much. Thank you to Mary, and thank you to the Newfoundland and Labrador Network for the Prevention of Elder Abuse, and to Seniors NL for the kind invitation to come and share some information about a very important piece of legislation in our province, but in general, a very important topic. So hopefully today is informative for you. Steve and I encourage you to ask lots of questions, and we will certainly do our best to answer those for you to the best of our ability. I will mention, and Mary mentioned in her introduction, the Adult Protection Act. It's been around since 2014. So in terms of in law years, it's a relatively new piece of legislation in the province. It applies, while we're talking today about experiences of older adults and abuse, the Adult Protection Act does apply to all adults in the province who are 18 years of age or older. The exception to that rule would be any individual who is being actively treated under the Mental Health Care and Treatment Act, or is under a community care order of that act. Steve, I think those are the only two exceptions.
Yes, yeah. Basically, if you wouldn't be covered, if you were certified, it wouldn't under the Mental Health Care Treatment Act. You wouldn't. It wouldn't come under the Adult Protection Act, of course. And of course, if you were a youth or a young adult, as defined in the Children, Youth, and Families Act.
Right. A couple of other general comments about the act before we move on. We call this an act of last resort, which basically means before we go to court and ask a judge to declare someone an adult in need of protective intervention, which means that they're going to come under my care and custody, we have to be very sure that everything else has failed in terms of mitigating the risk. And we have to demonstrate to the judge that everything has failed. Because if we use this law to the fullest extent, basically we're removing people's rights to make decisions. And that's why capacity, which we'll spend some time on talking about today, is so important. And for adult protection, it's the backbone of adult protection. Because again, as Mary said, abuse and neglect are alive and well, unfortunately. in our society, in all of our communities. But this act only applies in those cases where the adult does not understand or appreciate the risk of the abuse, neglect, or self-neglect. So if the person has capacity and abuse and neglect is happening, it's still not right. It's still a criminal matter. It's still assault, but adult protection may not necessarily be involved. But really, so the issue of capacity is a lot broader than adult protection, but it's certainly at the core of adult protection. Because as adults, we're all presumed to have capacity. And the burden of proof, if I'm going to say to a judge, well, Steve shouldn't make that decision anymore, again, I have to demonstrate that he doesn't have capacity to do that. I should mention as well that we're in the midst of a 5-year review of the Act. It doesn't mean it's taking 5 years, although it feels like that some days. It means that every 5 years, that piece of legislation has to be reviewed. So in 2021, we started that, in 2019, we started that review. And that's been pretty exhaustive. A lot of frontline conversations with frontline staff, managers, police, input from the general public, other stakeholders. So really kind of looking at ways to make the Act stronger, and there'll be more information coming out about that because we're looking at some amendments. So today, what we're hoping to do is talk a little bit about adult protection, really do a bit of a deep dive on the idea of capacity and why it's important. And in adult protection, we talk about decision-specific capacity or domain-specific capacity. And that's kind of a new concept as well. So it's more about your ability to make this decision at this moment in time versus someone is globally competent or incompetent. And we'll talk more about that. We'll talk a little bit about some of the things that clinicians think about before assessing capacity, because as you can imagine, for any clinician, this is a daunting task. So before clinicians take that on, wanted to share with you some of the, I guess, reflections that people would use when approaching capacity assessments and talk a bit about how it's assessed. Look at some of the frequently asked questions around the Act, and then look at sort of some steps moving forward. And again, always happy to have the discussion. So we've built in time for questions and answers. Steve and I always like to be interrupted and disagreed with. So please feel free to do that. And then we'll also share an evaluation with you of the session, because it's really important to get feedback to find out if information like this is helpful and what may be missing. So with that, I'll pause and I'll pass it over to Steve.
Hey, thanks, Henry. So just a couple of points here for an overview to the Act, folks. So as Henry alluded to, the Adult Protection Act is the law in Newfoundland and Labrador that protects the adult residents of the province who are at risk of abuse, neglect, or self-neglect, and who do not understand and appreciate the risk. And we'll discuss the criteria for coming under the Act shortly. But this idea of understand or appreciate the risk, that really refers to the concept of capacity that Henry touched on. And as Henry noted, very important to adult protection, and we'll of course discuss that in greater detail as we go through. The Act is also the legislative authority for the delivery of services to adults in need of protective intervention. So that means any services or resources or court orders that are completed for an adult who is abused or neglected or self-neglecting and does not understand and appreciate the risk are done in accordance to this piece of legislation. And under the Adult Protection Act, we all have a legal duty to report abuse, neglect, and self-neglect where a person may not understand or appreciate that risk. So a report can be received by a regional health authority, social worker, manager, a director, or a police officer as well. And that 1855 number there, that is the provincial toll-free number, can be called from anywhere in North America. And the number will take you to the intake of your local regional health authority, who will take that information. They screen the report and determine then whether an evaluation is merited based on that information. And helpful to note as well, folks, that reports can be provided confidentially. So if contact information is provided, all names of referral sources are kept confidential, unless, for example, that information disclosure is ordered by a court, for example.
Steve, to that, I might just add, what we have found is sometimes if people call the toll-free number from a cell phone, sometimes the technology isn't smart enough to know where the person's calling from. So you may use a cell phone on the west coast of the island, but the toll-free number doesn't know where you are, so it may route you first to Eastern, but then they would connect you with the proper health authority. The only other comment I'll make too about reporting, we do all have that legal obligation. It isn't the duty or responsibility of the report source to determine the capacity of the adult. So, because, again, that's an assessment process, and we're all assumed to be capable unless it's proven that we're not. But if you think abuse or neglect is happening and you think the person may not understand, you have to report. And then we kind of take it from there. Steve, back to you.
And folks, so the Act, as Henry mentioned too, still relatively new in law years, proclaimed in 2014, and it did replace the Neglected Adults Welfare Act of 1973. So this created a number of changes. For example, abuse is included in the new Act. So abuse can, of course, can take many forms and generally encompasses, along with neglect and self-neglect, the forms that are included in the Violence Prevention Initiative here in the province. So that could be physical, financial, sexual, emotional, could be psychological, verbal, it could be cultural as well as spiritual. And of course, those forms of abuse could occur in any context with or without capacity, but for adult protection purposes, a lack of capacity must also be present in those cases for the Act to apply. But the change also created this sort of four-step process that we'll touch on as well. And of course, the other big change that came in with the legislation is this idea of it just introducing this idea of capacity, which of course we'll discuss in greater detail. And another important distinction to make as well, folks, is that the Act is operationalized to the 4 regional health authorities and administered by the Department of Children, Seniors, and Social Development. So this means that all those reports and evaluations and investigations, that all takes place at the regional health authority level, while the Department of Children, Seniors, and Social Development is responsible for the administrative functioning of the Act. So that'd be the policies and the procedures and the legislation and whatnot. It should be noted as well, though, that the provincial director position, so in this case, Henry, also performs we would say, a decision maker function. So in the event all options to mitigate risk have been exhausted, and a decision maker of last resort, we'll say, is needed to mitigate risk, an application can be made to court to declare an adult to be in need of protective intervention, and then to come into the care and custody of the provincial director. And as I noted, the Act has also created this 4-step process for folks who maybe need a protective intervention. So this will be reporting, evaluations, investigations, and review. And we'll touch on this slide, this process in the next couple of slides, but just helpful to note that this is a legislative process that's used throughout the province. And there are, of course, legal responsibilities for folks throughout those steps. And as Henry had noted too, I think it's always helpful to note that the Adult Protection Act is we considered an act of last resort. So that is that folks are always looking for those opportunities to not use adult protection and to take less intrusive steps to support folks. And this is because, as Henry noted, it is recognized that the Act, if used to its fullest extent, can really interfere with a person's autonomy. So it's kind of in that spirit that we always say, that we almost have this dual commitment in adult protection to both support and protect vulnerable adults, but at the same time uphold and strengthen the autonomy of those adults as well. Anything to add on that piece, Henry?
No, I think that's good. Thanks, Steve. So the criteria of the Act applies to all adults, as we mentioned earlier, in the province who are 18 or older. So here's a definition. Here's our criteria for adult protection. So for an adult to fit under this piece of legislation, the person has, first and foremost, to lack the capacity to make the decision. And then they're either incapable of caring for themselves or they're experiencing abuse or neglect. So if these criteria are met, then the person could potentially come under the Adult Protection Act. And as Steve mentioned, because it's an act of last resort, we're always looking to work ourselves out of a job with adult protection. And we're hoping that we won't have to use the act at all. And in most cases, I think we'll share some stats later. In most cases, we don't need to use the act because there's a lot of great work happening in the regional health authorities to help support adults who need that support. So I will pass it back to Steve.
So folks, in terms of, I guess, how the process works, when a report is made, it is screened at an intake by the regional health authority to determine whether the report meets the criteria that Henry just spoke to. And when a report is received, a risk level is assigned in accordance with a risk continuum that has been developed. So as you can imagine, risk can range from low to extremely high. And this risk level is going to then determine the response time. This response time can range from immediate to 5 clear days, depending on the risk. And there are a number of factors, of course, that can impact risk. For example, folks are always going to be careful to look at, what is the allegation? And of course, what are some of those protective factors? Like, is there involvement from family and friends? Or what is the person's status in terms of capacity? All those things are going to inform the level of risk and then the response time. If the report is accepted and it proceeds to an evaluation, the purpose of the evaluation is very much to assess the situation and just make determinations around risk, capacity, and then how that risk can be mitigated. And the role of the social worker in that process is very much like a healthcare provider in that they are working with the person's consent. So they could be interviewing or observing the adult. They, of course, would be always assessing the level of risk, referring to police if criminal activity is suspected, and of course, gathering collateral information with the person's consent. And at the conclusion of that process, there are generally 3 outcomes. So, for example, one could be there could be no further involvement. So maybe the allegations were not substantiated. Another outcome could be just the provision of professional or supportive services. And of course, a final outcome could be that folks proceed with an investigation. So important to note that over 90% of all adult protection cases conclude at this evaluation stage, which really speaks to, I think, all the great work that gets done in the regions in supporting folks and mitigating risks in that least intrusive and restrictive way possible. In the event that the risk couldn't be mitigated, it does to proceed, as I alluded to, an investigation. So the investigation is very similar to the evaluation. However, a key difference here is that folks are no longer operating with the person's consent. So the role of the social worker, again, remains very much the same. So they're always assessing risk. They're going to refer to police if criminal activity is suspected. Of course, you're going to interview the adult, and it could include the coordination of a formal capacity assessment, which we'll touch on in this session. And of course, an investigation also has provisions around ability to access records or speak with collateral sources or interview persons that might have pertinent information. And then following the investigation, there are, again, just 3 general outcomes. So again, there could be no further involvement. There could be the provision of professional or supportive services. Or this is the piece where folks at the end of an investigation could make application to court to declare the adult to be in need of protective intervention. So as we've alluded to, this last step, as you would expect, is a last resort option and occurs very infrequently, as folks are often able to mitigate the risk and in far less intrusive ways. For example, maybe that could be some examples of a less intrusive way that it could be resolved could be that maybe a substitute decision maker comes forward from a healthcare perspective, or maybe a support person comes forward, or maybe the person implements a safety plan. So folks are always looking for those opportunities to mitigate risk and sort of park the adult protection process. And again, this is all in recognition that the act, as we've touched on, is, if used to the fullest extent, so in this case, the fullest extent being a court-ordered declaration, extremely intrusive and should, of course, only be used if all other options have been exhausted. in the event an adult is declared to be an adult in need of protective intervention, this initiates the fourth step of the process. So when an adult is declared, a service plan is developed with the adult to address the areas of risk. The plan is, of course, reviewed every 6 months, and the Act also has a legislative review committee process that meets yearly to review all those plans. And this review process is really important as well, because not only does it provide an opportunity to revisit the plans, but it's also designed in recognition that, and we'll touch on this more, that capacity can change. So, that review process really does provide that opportunity to review those plans and potentially revisit a person's capacity if necessary.
And Steve, the only thing I'll add, or just to reiterate that, I guess, you talked about evaluation and investigation. It is all really assessment. And the key difference being that if we shift from evaluation to investigation, we don't need the adult's consent anymore. We still try to maintain it, and we're always trying to maintain a positive relationship. But especially if capacity is in question, the adult may not be able to provide informed consent. Right? So if it's not informed consent, and again, it's not all or nothing, it's a bit of a continuum. So it may move from informed consent to assent or lack of disagreement. So the individual may not 100% understand, but they're still willing and able to work with you. So we're always still trying to involve the adult to the fullest extent possible. Sorry, Steve, back to you.
And folks, this is a decision tree that was created just really to highlight the adult protection process that we just spoke to. So really just a visual kind of representation of the process. And folks, I think, have found this to be a helpful tool just for that kind of quick reference when reviewing the process. It's not captured on the decision tree, but another area that we probably should note too as well, just from how the Act kind of functions, that there is an ability under the Act to complete an emergency intervention. So in the event a case came up where the risk of, say, substantial harm or is imminent and is believed that the person does not understand or appreciate the risk, there is an ability to intervene and act in an emergency and potentially remove that person to a place of safety. And again, this process is rarely used. However, that ability is there if the risk is high and folks need to act to protect someone from harm.
All right. Okay, here are some of the stats we promised. But they come with a warning that 46.7% of all statistics are made up on the spot. So just keep that in mind. So we do get about 90 reports every 3 months, and these come from throughout the province. 80% of our reports involve individuals who are 60 years of age or older. But then, of course, conversely, 20% of cases are involving individuals who are under the age of 60. I think so many individuals are over the age of 60. It's really reflective of the province's current population and our current demographics. So it's not surprising to see that. Neglect and self-neglect are among the most common sources of abuse, reported sources of abuse. So self-neglect, of course, that's the individual themselves not able to look after themselves. But then family and immediate caregivers are the highest, report source or alleged report source of abuse. Since the Act was proclaimed in 2014, we've had to complete about 40 formal capacity assessments. Again, this isn't something that we undertake lightly, because if that capacity assessment concludes that this particular individual does not have the ability to understand or appreciate decision A or decision B, and if the court agrees, then that adult doesn't get to make those decisions anymore. So it's really important that we have a what we call a valid trigger before we'd even go and ask about someone's capacity. And in the adult protection world, that valid trigger is risk. So Steve talked about that risk continuum, and based on the level of risk, that will determine how quickly we need to intervene. And again, very few cases have to move forward to investigation because efforts happen in the region to mitigate the risk. So, Steve, pass it back to you.
So, folks, the remainder of the session will probably largely touch on a lot of these concepts around capacity. But before we kind of started that discussion, thought it would be helpful to really open up with just some general thoughts on, why capacity? Why is it such a, I guess, a critical, why is it such a big deal in adult protection? And I think there's a couple of points to highlight here. First, all adults have that right to live, the lifestyle they're choosing. So that's not something that's just, of course, embedded in the adult protection process, but it's really enshrined in the, the rights and freedoms under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And, not only do we have that right to live the lifestyle of our choosing, but we have that right to live at risk and make choices that other folks may consider to be bad or unwise, for example. And I mean, those are just fundamental freedoms that I guess apply across laws and jurisdictions throughout Canada, and of course, beyond adult protection. Yet, while we have those fundamental rights, we also recognize that there are times when someone could be at risk of harm and are unable to understand and appreciate that risk. So we always say, it's this bit of a dilemma between, on the one hand, someone's autonomy, and on the other hand, this, responsibility to protect. And I think that's kind of a fundamental dilemma that I think all folks struggle with. And the concept of capacity is really used to try to get at that kind of balance. Does this person understand and appreciate this risk? And if they don't, we as helping professionals have that, of course, responsibility to intervene and support that person. So again, the concept's really about, finding that balance and recognizing that capacity is really deeply interconnected with the rights of all individuals to exercise choice. And related to that, I think it's also important to note that when we think about, the idea of capacity, we recognize that, history is important. So while great strides have been made in this area, I think it's important to reflect on that historically many persons, including seniors or persons with a disability, were in some contexts historically denied, those dignities or of risk and choice that have been afforded to other folks under the pretense of, as it was referred to, being incompetent to make a decision. And we'll touch on these pieces more as we work our way through. But I think it's helpful to highlight this because it does provide kind of context to why so much emphasis gets placed on upholding a person's rights and practicing adult protection and capacity from that kind of least intrusive and restrictive stance.
And Steve, it's a good point just before we move to the next slide. With adult protection, we're also talking about court processes, and it's ultimately a judge who makes that decision if an adult is going to come under the care and custody of the provincial director. And, with our charters and with other documents, we all, need to think about those foundational documents that give all of us that equitable right. So we think about the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Article 12 talks about equitable representation under the law. So if we're in court under adult protection, the adult who's presumed to be incapable also has that right to equitable representation under the law. So throughout the amendment process with the Act, it's already a solid piece of legislation, but we've really been focusing on procedural protections for adults. So ensuring that there is proper communication and spokespersons and the right to legal counsel and all those other pieces that are so vital in protecting people's fundamental rights. So we've talked a lot about it. Capacity is it's a fluid concept. I guess I'll start there. It's not really concrete. There's a lot of things that can happen in our lives that influence our capacity or our ability to understand and appreciate. It could be a disease process. It could be an acute illness. It could be a temporary delirium. It may be an advancing dementia or another disease process. It could be intoxication with drugs and alcohol. It could be a urinary tract infection that temporarily, gives us a delirium. So there's lots of things that influence capacity. So it's a bit of a moving target. So getting back to one of our earlier points, I think that's why this is such an important conversation, not just for adult protection, but for all of us, whether we're providing service or receiving service. Just as citizens of the province, it's an important conversation to have in terms of the rights that we all share to make our own decisions and to live at risk and to exercise that capacity. So again, with adult protection, the magic words with capacity are always understand and appreciate. And while these are related, they're two separate concepts. So while I may be able to understand, I may be able to take in information and understand it, I may not appreciate how or if it affects me personally. So for example, we may have an adult who says, you know, I understand that with my heart medication, you should not mix this with alcohol. I've read the articles, like if you take these pills with booze, you may kill yourself. I understand that, but that's not the case for me because I always take my pills with alcohol and it doesn't affect me. So while the person understands, they may not fully appreciate. So, and we'll talk about the assessment of capacity, but it really very much equally considers those two pieces. So it does include, understanding information in these different areas. So we talk about healthcare, physical, emotional care, financial. These are all different domains. So again, with adult protection, we talk about decision-specific capacity. So for example, you may not be able to manage your own finances, but you still may be able to make healthcare decisions. Or you may be able to make simple healthcare decisions like, yes, I would like a flu shot, but you may not be able to make complex decisions like, yes, I will have a lung transplant. So the nature of the decision, so you can see it's very fluid and there's lots of different variables and considerations. And again, the adult needs to be able to appreciate the foreseeable consequences. No one is a fortune teller, but the foreseeable, reasonable consequences of a decision or the lack of a decision. And can the adult articulate that? So again, sticking with this idea of capacity, there's a couple of related concepts that I think are important to consider here. So, and each of them have, I guess, different thresholds or different requirements. So clinical capacity is essentially clinicians from different disciplines. So it may be medicine, maybe social work, a behavior management specialist, psychologist, different professions. In their clinical opinion or their professional judgment, the adult in question really shouldn't be making decision X, whatever the decision is at hand. So that's a clinical opinion. And in some cases, depending on the piece of law that's in play, that's enough to be able to take away someone's decision-making right. So for example, under the Advanced Healthcare Directives Act in our province that looks after healthcare directives, which came out in 1995, if it's the clinical opinion of a doctor that a person cannot or shouldn't make a healthcare decision, that physician can document that opinion and that would actually stand. So that's met the clinical threshold for determining capacity. With adult protection, there's a second, I guess, safeguard in that a judge has to agree with that clinical opinion. So an interdisciplinary team will work on an assessment capacity on a particular adult and come up with a consensus and an opinion. But until a judge agrees with that, that adult still has that decision-making right. So as you can probably imagine, that's good because we need to maintain the rights, but as you can imagine, operationally, sometimes that creates a challenge because the team may very quickly decide, and it may be very clear, look, this person clinically cannot make this decision, and there's a lot of risk here. But according to the court folks, it's going to be 3 months until we get a hearing and a judge gets to hear it. So with adult protection, sometimes we're stuck in that limbo where there's a lot of risk, but from a legal perspective, the adult still has the right to make that decision. So a lot of ethical, a lot of moral issues come up with these cases on a regular basis. And Steve and I spent a lot of our time in conversation with the health authorities and kind of working through some of these cases. So again, all adults are presumed to be capable in adult protection. Sometimes people confuse adult protection with child protection. A fundamental difference is that under child protection, children are considered to not have capacity to make decisions, but adults were all presumed as adults to have that capacity. Steve alluded to the fact that the whole idea of capacity was introduced when this act came out in 2014. Before that, we considered we talked more about competency, and that was more global, more all or nothing, black or white. I like to think about it as a light switch. So you're competent or you're not. The lights are on or they're off. With capacity, it's more of that sliding scale. So again, you may have capacity in some areas or not. Just because you have a diagnosis of a mental illness or a diagnosis of dementia, or you live with a disability, it doesn't mean that you're incapable. These factors may impact someone's decision-making capability, but it doesn't mean that they're incapable. So it's a shift of just that presumption of, oh, well, as soon as someone shows the sign of incapacity, then you're out of the game and you don't make decisions anymore. So that's been an education for all of us. So we're all kind of on that learning curve together. And that includes clinicians, that includes judges, the general public, that includes Steve and I, who are trying to do this on a daily basis. It's that whole idea of that right to live at risk, that sliding scale of capacity, and how capacity can change over time. I should say as well that courts are moving away from that, again, that global competency piece, and thinking more about that, more narrow, decision-specific or domain-specific decision-making ability. Also important to keep in mind that how capacity is assessed and determined can vary depending on where you are and what piece of law you're using. So I gave the example already of adult protection versus the Healthcare Directives Act. But we also see across the country, the law is different and the practice is a little bit different. So really, it's an understandable confusion that, if we're not all defining capacity the same, if we're not all assessing it the same, then there will be those misunderstandings, and there will be those cases where sometimes, the system is not really sure how to proceed. Is this mental health? Is it adult protection? Is it healthcare directives? Does it have to go to court? So it's case specific. Right, I will pass it back to Steve.
And so, folks, these are just sort of a lot of the concepts that Henry just alluded to. So, for example, decision specific. So again, it is recognized now that capacity can exist in one area, but not necessarily another. For example, someone could have the ability to make personal healthcare decisions, but maybe not some financial decisions. So, and we're really looking at, what is this person's ability to make a specific decision at a specific time? And as Henry mentioned, this is a big shift in practice, and it's still ongoing and evolving, I think, across different areas and professions. And in line with that, our assessments would also be decision specific, which we will touch on here again shortly. It should also be noted that if a person is found to lack capacity in one area, they are still presumed to have it in respect to other decisions. So if an individual was found to lack capacity in respect to their financial decisions, let's say, they would still be presumed to be capable in other areas until proven otherwise. And it is also recognized that capacity is very much on a continuum. So as we touched on, it's not this all or nothing kind of on or off type kind of binary concept. It's recognized that there are more degrees of capacity, and folks can be more or less capable in respect to particular decisions. So you will often hear folks make the comparison of a light switch versus a dimmer. So over time, it is being recognized that capacity is not this kind of on or off type global concept, but more or less there are degrees or kind of shades of capacity, we would say. And this is in part because capacity, as Henry mentioned, is fluid. So not only is it decision specific, it's also fluid. It's recognized that it can change. So it's not something that you acquire and is necessarily fixed. So it's kind of in that spirit that not only can capacity be reassessed, but as we mentioned, adults that are declared have their plans consistently reviewed to ensure that any changes in capacity are met with changes in a person's status. And another big piece that we touched on as well, remember, is that capacity is not defined by a diagnosis or disability. So for example, an individual with a severe mental illness or an intellectual disability could potentially have challenges understanding and appreciating particular risk. However, that diagnosis does not imply this or mean that that can be assumed. So much like the concept of decision specific, I think, that is also an evolving area. We touched on this in kind of when we chatted about some of the history stuff earlier. I think there is still a tendency out there to think that, if someone, does have, for example, a cognitive impairment, that their decision making is automatically in question. So a person develops mild dementia and their ability to make decisions immediately comes into question. However, I think it is recognized now that folks are kind of saying, okay, hold on. Just because someone receives such a diagnosis does not mean that they lack capacity and are unable to make their decisions. And Henry touched on this as well, some of those temporary factors. So, for example, a person could be suffering from, delirium due to a UTI, or could be experiencing a psychotic episode, or could be impaired due to substance use. It could be the time of the day or a lack of sleep. There are a number of those temporary factors that could impact a person's capacity. And we would all say those factors should be resolved to the best of our ability before we proceed with a formal assessment. And finally, folks, as we kind of noted as well in the previous discussion, capacity is very much sort of this clinical and legal concept. It's not necessarily a diagnosis. So there's no real magic formula where there's kind of a checklist of symptoms that we can kind of check quantitatively and determine a person's capacity from that. It's very much intertwined with within the context in which a person lives and their values and their preferences. And as a result, it's ultimately the judgment of the assessor, informed by an understanding of the adult and an assessment, that ultimately would determine someone's capacity.
That's a good point. And one of the things that we really try to stress with clinicians, because again, assessing capacity is a very big job. We really work hard to support clinicians to build that clinical confidence to do this work. So there's a lot of education and effort that goes into that. So we'll just touch on a little bit of the capacity assessment process itself. And really, again, what we try to emphasize with clinicians who are going to undertake this work, first and foremost, is that there has to be a valid trigger. Like before you even come to say like, oh, yeah, I don't think Steve should be allowed to make that decision. That's a pretty bold statement. So there has to be some reason why we'd even start the capacity assessment. So again, in the adult protection world, the valid trigger has to do with risk. And we see some examples here of some of those triggers. Maybe there is an imminent danger. Maybe there is a significant change in a person's behavior. We try to apply what we call the lens of reasonableness. Is this something that a person would normally or reasonably do in this situation? If it's something that's really out of character for the person, maybe there's something going on here. Have I exhausted all of the other options? So, for example, someone may be at risk. So someone's discharging from hospital. There's concern about them living alone. Like, well, I don't think this person can understand or appreciate the risk. But before we jump to assessing their capacity, the social worker may go talk to them and say, well, Steve, you're getting ready to go home now. Everyone's kind of worried about you living at home. What would you think about some home support? And Steve might say, well, it sounds best kind to me. So in that case, there's no need to assess Steve's capacity. He may lack capacity, but at that point, who cares? Like there is no risk. There's no risk of abuse, neglect, or self-neglect there. So that's a really simple black and white example, but it's important. And we often find ourselves with the regions and ourselves kind of holding back. Like there's we're tempted sometimes to jump to that capacity assessment. But sometimes that has to do with more with my risk threshold and my tolerance for risk than it does for that individual. So that's why, again, it's so important to have that assessment and the focus on the person themselves. So we remind clinicians, and it's a good reminder for all of us, to check our own biases and beliefs, because it's very easy to look at another person and say, like, I would never live like that. And we get calls from adult protection, like, my neighbor is doing this, this, and this. You shouldn't let him live like that. Maybe, so it's a fair question if there's potential risk, but we all have those rights to live as we choose. So are there least intrusive or restrictive options? Again, before we gallop off and do a capacity assessment, or we bring someone into long-term care or hospital and detain them and assess, maybe there's more ways to meet the person where they are and work with them to resolve this. And really, it's weighing it out. It's that autonomy versus risk. Is the intrusion of the assessment proportional to the risk? And if not, then we really don't have any business in assessing someone's capacity. So it's something that we're very careful to use only when we need to. So again, just with some of the stats, we had over 1,400 reports in the first 5 years, only 40 capacity assessments, and really only 3 or 4 adults who needed to go the full extent of the law and come under my care and custody. So I think that's a good thing. So again, some of the other things that are considered, we try to help clinicians think about what they're actually assessing. So what is at issue here? So with adult protection, we have a team approach. So it's not just down to the doctor or the social worker or the nurse practitioner to say this person does or doesn't have capacity. And we did a team approach because it's best practice. And we see it in the literature and other jurisdictions. And we see it locally starting to be used for cases other than adult protection cases. And it really takes the pressure off any one health professional to make that call. And I think it's also more respective of the person and upholds their rights a little bit more, because there needs to be that team consensus. And each profession kind of comes at things from a little bit of a different perspective. But before any of those disciplines assess capacity, they need to be very clear on what they're assessing. Also, that self-reflection piece. What are my values in relation to risk? So I may never live like that, but maybe this person has lived like that their whole lives. Maybe that is their baseline. That's their normal. So I need to be very aware of, how I'm perceiving or how I'm thinking about someone else's living situation. Have I informed the adult? So even though I as a social worker going in to assess capacity, I think maybe this person doesn't have capacity, but I still have an obligation to make sure that therapeutic clinical relationship is as strong as any other relationship, and there's good communication and that there's trust. So really, we try to stress, particularly to social workers who assess capacity, there's really a dual role here. Like you're assessing capacity, but you're also supporting capacity. Because really, if we're working with adults to work on independence and self-realization and all these other excellent principles that, all of us good health folks work towards, if we're doing that, then I am involving the adult. And sometimes, again, because this team approach is kind of new, we do get pushback, sometimes from disciplines, sometimes from managers, sometimes from professional colleges or associations. A social worker may say, well, it's not really in my scope of practice to assess capacity. But what we reassure or remind clinicians is that we're really always assessing capacity in some way, shape, or form. So if I'm in a therapeutic relationship, if I'm in that conversation, I'm always seeking that understanding. Like we're having that conversation. I'm talking to Steve about discharge from hospital. does he have adequate information to make this decision? Don't ask me to make an informed decision without enough information. So then once he has it, does he understand? How's that dialogue? So we're always looking for that understanding. So it's trying to help clinicians, I guess, kind of normalize the process a bit and say, even though it's kind of daunting, it is still very much within your scope of practice to do that. Steve, anything to add to that one before I pass it back to you?
No, that's great, Henry. Yeah.
Okay. All right, back to you.
In terms of how we formally assess capacity under adult protection, so as Henry noted, we do use an interdisciplinary process. So under the adult protection regulations, 7 professions are identified as being able to assess capacity under the Act. So that would include social work, speech language pathology, nursing, physiotherapy, psychology, occupational therapy, and medicine. So this process is used because it is recognized, this interdisciplinary process, I should say, is used because it is recognized that, the best capacity assessment is a thorough one involving the adult and a team of professionals. And we'll describe this process in greater detail in the next slide, but important to note that the process is really in recognition that I think all professionals have that important role to play in assessing capacity under the Act. So depending on the risk and the situation, any one or more of those professions could play a vital role in determining a person's ability to understand and appreciate a particular risk. And Henry alluded to it, this is definitely a new approach for assessing capacity in the province. Has not been without its challenges, but I think the process itself can be very beneficial, particularly if we think about capacity with that more holistic lens. So, where these multiple, where you can get these multiple kind of professional perspectives, and all that could really enrich the process and ensure that we're getting kind of a comprehensive view of the adult's capacity. So folks, as we noted, we do use an interdisciplinary approach. Process where possible is coordinated by a social worker. So as Henry mentioned, they kind of play a dual role in this process where they're both responsible for completing their own assessment of capacity, but also responsible for coordinating their own assessment. So generally before this process begins, a risk will have been identified and all options to mitigate risk have been attempted, of course, at this point, and the assessment then becomes necessary if the adult appears unable to understand and appreciate those risks associated with the allegations. And again, all those other options have been tried. The social worker then would identify the appropriate professions to include in the process, which again is dependent on that area of risk. So if there were risks around particular areas of independent living, let's say, the social worker may reach out to a occupational therapist or a medicine and physiotherapy. The team would then come together to kind of clarify the areas of risk that would be assessed. So they would essentially develop what we say was a capacity question. So in this case, does the adult understand and appreciate the risks of living independently? Each professional then assesses the adult independently in relation to the decision with their own kind of professional lens, we would say. So for example, an OT could do a functional assessment, whereas physiotherapy may look at maybe there's a falls risk. So maybe a physiotherapy would look at that part of it. Or maybe, maybe social work could complete a clinical interview. Following all those assessments and a review of all the reports, a discussion is then held, of course, to make that determination around whether the adult is capable of understanding or appreciating that specific risk. So again, still a very new process, evident in that, as we touched on, only approximately 40 of these have been done in adult protection. And so certainly, and as we know, we've certainly had some challenges in certain circumstances, but I think the value of the process is recognized in that the assessment of capacity in adult protection is recognized to be, a shared one. And it's recognized that various professions can contribute and enrich that process. Anything to add there, Henry?
Just to say that, just to reiterate the part around the decision-specific capacity question or questions. Really important that the team establishes that and is in agreement. So that's again about narrowing it down, and it's not about that global competency. So if the decision is just around your healthcare decision, I don't need to get into your finances and talk about that. So before those disciplines go off, it's good to have that understanding. And I guess the other thing I'll say, again, because the act is relatively new, the education that we're focusing on is really trying to help professionals see themselves in this process. And to Steve's point is to remind them that, like, if no matter if you're a social worker, if you're a doctor, if you're an OT, you have a role to play in this process.
So look, every case I think will be unique, and any determinations of capacity I think they're always going to look different. But these are just some general things to consider kind of when we're thinking about just the idea of capacity and a lack of capacity. So just some generalized, general reflections that might be helpful for folks to consider when, kind of thinking about the idea. Of course, the list is not exhaustive, but just some things to kind of be thinking about. So maybe, can the adult communicate in their preferred method the issue and level of risk? Because let's say we have a very serious case of self-neglect. Folks come across an adult who has, let's say, no heat in the home, there's windows removed in the home, no running water, it's the middle of winter, just a risky living situation. Can the adult describe what's happening? Can they communicate to you with support if needed to indicate that they are talking about their living situation and the risks around that? Is the adult able to participate in a discussion? Can they have a conversation with what's happening? Can they have a conversation with, the windows being gone, the no heat or the no water, and or does the adult ask questions? Do they ask questions that may indicate that they kind of follow and understand the conversation and the situation? Or a big one folks would always look to, can the adult comprehend the information that's discussed? So does the adult comprehend what's being discussed? Can they comprehend that the heat isn't working or that the water is off, or, or the impact that would have? And does the adult have the knowledge to manage their needs? Can they call 911? Can they make a doctor's appointment? Can they call someone to fix the windows and the heat? Do they know how to arrange that? Can they be supported to do that? And related to that, can they identify options? Can they highlight, I can do this to address this? I can call my friend to help me with the windows. I already called about my electricity. I can call 911 if something happens, or I can make a doctor's appointment if I need to address a medical issue. And one, too, as well, I think to be cognizant of is, does the adult give, we would say, consistent or logical answers to the question? So someone brings up that they're very concerned with the situation, and the person responds that they say, well, I don't need heat or windows, I'm superhuman. Or I don't need water because I'm cured, I don't need to drink water. Are their responses, I guess what we're trying to get at with that piece is, are their responses logical? Are their responses reasonable, considering the situation? And related to that, does the adult, for example, acknowledge that there is a problem? Does the person, the windows are gone and there's no heat in the middle of winter, do they accept that is a fact and that it could impact them? And related to that, we always say, does the adult display insight? Does the adult display a sense of, say, self-awareness? So, for example, if a person has a serious risk that is impacting their safety and their well-being, are they aware that they have that risk and the consequences of that risk could be impacting them? So those are just some kind of general things that folks will consider when kind of thinking about capacity. A closing point on that, though, that will be helpful to make is that would always be viewed with the lens of the adult's preferences and values. So depending on the person, that lifestyle may be in line with the person's way of being or their way of life, which of course need to be considered when we're kind of, before immediately kind of jumping to a conclusion around, should the person be able to make that decision? But if, for example, a person was always known to be someone that, with the example I gave, if it was someone that was always known to have really looked after their home and, or paid their bills on time, and all of a sudden they no longer have heat and running water, that will be kind of a case where be a red flag where people are seeing these big shifts in a person's, just behavior and character and just general preferences, I would say.
And that general preferences piece, the input from the adult is so critical. And a lot of times it's in the approach. So instead of, again, using Steve as the example in hospital going home, instead of going in and saying, well, Steve, you can't go home for the following reasons. It's, look, the team is worried about this, this, and this. What do you think about that? And that's how we start to gauge Steve's, insight into the actual issue. The other point that we make with clinicians in particular, when they're assessing capacity, is that an assessment tool is not an assessment. So an assessment tool is an assessment tool. And a lot of times clinicians look for those ticky boxes and we look to quantify stuff. And that can work sometimes, like you can do, on this functional score, you get 10 out of 20 or whatever. And sometimes that's okay. But there's that qualitative piece as well, particularly for social work, where the tool is the clinical interview. And it's the clinical judgment of the person and the quality of that clinical relationship between the social worker and the adult. So a couple of really important, I guess, points to keep in mind as well. Some of the frequently asked questions, and I'm sure there's more, and there's more out of the session this morning. Some of the frequently asked questions that we've come across so far, we've touched on a couple. People wonder when to report. Like, my next door neighbor is there. He has 87 cats and it's March and he's out hanging up his clothes on the clothesline. And again, it has to do with people's perception and threshold and acceptance of levels of risk. So again, the legal obligation is there. If you think the adult is abused or neglected or self-neglecting and you're not sure they really understand it, you have to call. The second point there is one actually that was raised in particular by the seniors advocate last fall in her report that came out actually 2019. She raised the issue of, a lot of adults are at risk, but they have capacity. So what happens then? And we do see this sometimes, particularly with older adults as well. So for example, an older adult may be quite cognitively well and quite capable, but they're being coerced or bullied or forced by a family member to sign over their check on a regular basis. So, that gets a little bit questionable then, because the person doesn't lack capacity, so adult protection isn't going to step in, but there's definitely something not right here. I mean, this is still criminal activity. That's still theft. The person's money is being robbed, but it becomes a little bit more complicated to support those adults to say, look, you need to report to the police that your son is taking your money. Or, you need to report the fact that your daughter-in-law, who's supposed to be looking after you every day, is not feeding you 2 of your meals or helping you with your pills. That's neglect. But sometimes I think adults in those situations, if I'm in that situation and I'm very reliant on that person or that situation for my well-being, it could be very, very difficult to put up your hand and ask for help. So that's why we see, and certainly we see it with the work that the network does, abuse and neglect generally are very underreported, right? So the stats, it's kind of the iceberg effect. We see the stats, but that's scratching the surface. And I don't think we always see what's going on underneath. So again, what now? What can we do if the adult has capacity? We have to support and provide information as much as we can, while at the same time walking that line of respecting that person's right to refuse service and to choose. We've gotten a lot of questions, especially when we did the roadshow throughout the province for the 5-year review with health authority staff about standardized tools. So again, like I said, an assessment tool is not an assessment, but there's lots of examples in the literature, in other jurisdictions, and Steve's been doing a lot of homework in looking at what are some of those examples and best practices from other areas. We've lived with this piece of law now for 5 or 6 years. We've learned a whole lot from a lot of different cases. So how do we take all of that and the other knowledge that's out there and really look at how can we build that clinical confidence for people to do this and give them standardized tools while still helping them understand that, you need that clinical judgment to go along with that. Again, what questions should I ask kind of related to the standardized tools? more discussion and education is necessary and is happening about that whole idea of decision-specific capacity. One of the, pardon me, one of the things we heard loud and clear is that there needs to be more discussion, provincially about this whole idea. Before COVID, one of the things Steve and I had talked about and was suggested by the health authorities was, for example, doing like a webinar like this on a regular basis, but almost like a grand rounds to talk about capacity. So a health authority may have a case example and we can all kind of sign on because, there's no experts here. I always like to say, we don't have experts. We're all working together to develop expertise in this area. And that's a collective responsibility. So I think we can all contribute to that community of practice by being aware, by having conversations like this, being involved in the discussions. Very important. And what about other decision-making areas? So again, it's trying to keep it to the domain at hand. And really, again, it's about this decision at this time. Are we worried about the person's ability to make this decision? Well, why is that? And how could we support the adult to do that? Steve, anything else to add to that before I pass it back to you?
I would say just on that point about, the adult has capacity, but there is risk. I think it really goes back to almost those dilemmas, the whole dilemma that we kind of talked about in the beginning around protection and autonomy. So we have these cases where someone is living with risk and they have capacity. And, I think those, as you mentioned, those cases can be really difficult because we know that, yes, the person may have capacity, has the right to make a choice, and APA may not be an option, but we also recognize that in many circumstances, a person's choices can, of course, be limited. So, if an older adult was being financially abused by a loved one, they may be capable, but they may also be, of course, reluctant to seek help because of that relationship they have with that person. So I think it really does speak to those dilemmas and how complex and challenging it can be for everybody.
Mm-hmm. All right, Steve, back to you.
And just to clue up, folks, I know I'm just cognizant of the time and I want to leave some time for some questions at the end, but just the couple other points that we're kind of considering, I guess, moving forward. So as we touched on this idea of understand and appreciate. So I think one thing we've seen in other jurisdictions, for example, is, folks really spend a lot of time, kind of defining what they mean by those terms, and attention is given to kind of breaking those concepts down even more, so what do we mean by understand information? What do we mean by appreciate? So definitely something that's kind of on our radar moving forward. As Henry mentioned as well, a lot of those, the same can be said for some of those procedural protections for adults. So, as we mentioned, adult protection is so interconnected with a person's right to make decisions and exercise choice. And that's really been evident across so many adult protection cases. And I think we always need to continue to further support that kind of rights-based lens and continue to incorporate those procedural kind of protections into the process as much as we can. And Henry really hit the nail on the head with this one about supporting a community of practice. I think, so as capacities, as you could expect, it was such a huge conversation in the 5-year review. And related to this is the idea, how can we continue to support kind of the knowledge development in the area? How can we support that confidence of folks moving forward? And also, how can we raise awareness around things like this, the right to live at risk? And I think there's a number of things that, of course, we could be doing that. So, of course, training is going to be really important. I think resource sharing is going to be key. And I think conversations like this that we're having today are going to be essential, again, for moving forward on these conversations and continuing the discussion.
All right, and so you see our coordinates there, and we'll certainly do Q&A now, but following up from this, any questions, certainly don't hesitate to call Steve.
I think
you can also call me. Sorry, Mary, back to you.
I think, Megan, did you have some questions?
I do believe I have a question, Miles, here. Or Megan?
Megan? No questions?
Yes, Megan, I have a question. Yes, I do. They're fighting who's going to ask, Megan or Miles. Miles being funny. My question is with regarding your presentation. Of course, it was fabulous. Lots there to learn. Wondering about, about the awareness piece. If you meet a deaf individual, in terms of the awareness, and how do you approach that individual in terms of a senior or an adult at risk, or if they're requiring help or assistance, what exactly is it that you do?
So it is dependent on the situation, and again, the assessment part is carried out in the regions by the staff of the regional health authority. But we have had cases where an individual may require ASL interpretation, or written communication, or some other type of communication support. And one of the service principles of the Act is that every adult has the right to be heard, and there's a responsibility on us as the system to support and facilitate that conversation, however it needs to happen. So the expectation is there. I don't think the practice is always there because, again, I think we have a lot of ways to improve the way that we deliver information and services to individuals who are deaf and hard of hearing.
And just to add to that, Henry, as well, I forget the exact wording in the legislation, but it does speak to the idea that a person's form of communication cannot really have an impact on how folks would assess capacity, if you will. So you can't be presumed, you can determine that someone lacks capacity based on their form of communication, of course.
And further to that, if we can't figure out a way to communicate with the adult, we have to presume that they are capable.
Exactly.
Because
right.
Again, that presumption is there until we can prove that they're not.
Questions from anyone else? Miles?
Miles, yes, sure. Hello, everyone. Hello, Henry and Steve. Nice to see you again. It's been a long time. Been involved with, employment and protection of adults and in the Act. I have a few concerns myself. How can adults become fully APA, help the individuals who require ASL? Just sorry, the interpreter's having a hard time seeing Miles there. I'm getting partial signs. So I apologize for that. I had to get farther back from the computer. I got bad eyes. It was just an interpreter error there. Okay, so apologize about the interruption. So the deaf community have their own language, their own linguistics, and it is very, unique. So in terms of that team approach, the social worker, they don't necessarily have that cultural linguistic background because it is very unique to the deaf individual. I've seen that team approach, but they don't bother to contact the organization, the professional organization, the NLAD in this particular situation, to be involved in that team approach for the assessment piece of the individual. So it may be neglected in terms of that danger or the risk by that assessment team. So, and they're not familiar with the deaf client and their living situation, and it may be very different, the communication, whether it be written or signed or whatnot. We have the resources to offer in those situations, in those services to be provided to the team for the comprehension piece of the capacity of the professionals as of the individuals, but we feel like we've been potentially left out of those pieces as a professional. So, saying here in the Zoom platforms, hard to get all the nuances when interpreting, but I think the question there is clear. Is that clear, Henry and Steve?
Again, I think we have a lot of work to do to improve, but I think that I agree with you, Miles. I think there are more ways to more consistently engage with NLAD to ensure that that support is there and that process is there. I know that as we go through amendments to the legislation, we're making a few changes to the Act. Most of the changes are coming in policy. So as we rewrite the policy manual and we're building in supports and education for staff around interviewing adults, we're going to be considering some of those, like those language pieces, including ASL, and also recognizing the fact that we have, Indigenous individuals in the province. We have newcomers in the province for whom English is not their first language. Yeah, no, I fully agree with you. I think it's happening in little bits and pieces, but it's not consistent, and we need to do a better job because we have to ensure that adults communicate in the way that they have to. I mean, that's at the heart and soul of adult protection and the right to live as we want to live. So, yeah, important point and lesson learned. And I see more opportunities for partnership with. And I'm thinking as well, even in terms of the public information and the provincial website. And we've done a little bit of this with the support of NLAD around some of our grant programs and, how to fill out applications, and some of that's been translated. But, you think about adult protection information, this is vital health information. So I know NLAD has worked in the past, like with health and other groups, to help disseminate and get information out. So it should be similar with adult protection as well. So I'd like to chat offline about it.
Megan, did you have something else?
That sounds good. Wonderful.
Yeah, Megan.
I would like to add to what Miles was saying. I know that we were talking about the issues that had come up, and there have been a few times that I have noticed, for example, that a deaf client would be involved in a situation, and then they realize that maybe the team was probably looking for support, maybe to get a family member to come in and help, or a social worker, whatnot, and they would forget about us as the organization, as Newfoundland and Labrador Association of the Deaf, because the services that we offer are very extensive. And and again, I know it's possible that the whole process can get skewed because information is missing. And when information is missing, then we're not getting the full story. So I really like to emphasize our involvement into these processes for the Adult Protection Act. And I also wanted to emphasize that it's really important that, that the interpreter would be involved in this situation, as well as a DI, a deaf interpreter, and to make sure there's a community support person, which is me, hello. So to make sure that we are all involved in this process as a part of the team, because this planning, I mean, the only way to make sure that this happens in its entirety and that these the proper decisions are made is to make sure that the team is wholesome, just to make sure that all of the choices are offered. I also wanted to add as well that if a client is brought in, and we notice something, say, for example, there's a family member that comes to interpret for this deaf individual in a situation like this, please encourage them to use interpreting services along with a DI, a deaf interpreter, because then that information is crucial, and then that information is 100% accurate, because sometimes you'll get a family member with that are very biased, so sometimes the information may be skewed. So when we're talking about following the following the policies and making sure we have full access, then we could ask, maybe you could ask this of the team, is to make sure that the professionals are involved. I mean, the expectations on the family, like say, for example, if there was an uncle to come in, or if you're interpreting for an aunt, I mean, sometimes the children have to, you know, interpret for these situations. And I mean, they might be 10 or 12 years old and they're interpreting for some situation like this, and it's not ethical, and it's not okay. So we just want to make this a better process and more inclusive for everyone. And I mean, that's my priority. That's my primary concern. And I think it really needs to be addressed and to put in the forefront of everyone's mind when it comes to these policies.
Excellent points. Thank you, Megan. And I agree 100%. And another important reason to have professional interpretation is that sometimes a family member who may be along to do the interpretation could be the alleged source of abuse or neglect.
Yeah.
So, you know, we, under adult protection, we try to maintain family ties as much as possible, but sometimes it's not appropriate. And sometimes the adult doesn't want that. So there have to be, yeah, so I agree with you. And if we think about it, again, there's not a whole lot of adult protection cases that go down that road. So I don't think the volume of work would be too bad, but you know, it's a really important element. So yeah, definitely see more discussion with NLAD moving forward. So.
Sure. Excellent points, folks.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say that Megan's saying, I just wanted to say that I have seen that over a number of times, that the family member is involved. So I just wanted to see that I just wanted to let you know that the family member has interpreted at times, and it hasn't been a good situation.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions? Everybody good? We're going to be, Miles.
Yes, hi there. I just wanted to say thank you so much for having this meeting today and having the deaf community involved in this roundtable. I absolutely look forward to meeting with you soon and to get this plan in action. Thank you so very much. Megan says, yes, I agree. Thank you. Thank you. Really appreciate it.
And thank you too from us, Henry and Steve, and to all of you for participating. It was really great to see you. And Miles, to see your face again, lovely. And early next week, we will be sending out a link to the recording so that you can refer to it, and also Henry's slides. Good. And one other thing, we do have a survey that Henry and Steve would love to have you fill out. If you want, just take a few minutes to do that. I just put the link in the chat box, and I'll probably end up sending that out again Monday if you all don't respond over the weekend. Okay, thanks so much, everybody. Anybody else? Okay, bye.
Thank you, folks. Take care.
One second, for the interpreter, the chat box was, and it was hiding Megan's comment.
Megan just said, thanks so much for having us and for setting up this this meeting for the deaf community to be involved. It's very much appreciated. Thank you, Mary.
Okay, bye. Bye, everyone. Have a good weekend. Stay safe.